Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. There are moments in life when fear doesn't feel like a reaction. It feels like an entity, a shadow lurking beside you, inside you, breathing down your neck. I don't think I ever truly understood that until the night I woke up to find something standing at the foot of my bed. I had always been a heavy sleeper. I'd sleep through thunderstorms, blaring car alarms, even an earthquake once, back in college. But on this particular night, something had dragged me out of a deep sleep, forcing me awake with a sudden, chilling awareness. It was the silence that struck me first. My house was old, one of those places that groaned and creaked as it settled, and there was always some noise, a faucet dripping, a floorboard shifting. But that night everything was completely still, so quiet that my ears rang with the absence of sound. That's when I noticed the figure. At first I thought I was dreaming. Blinking, I tried to make out what it was, my brain still groggy with sleep, struggling to piece together what I was seeing. It was tall and still, an outline just slightly darker than the rest of the room, standing perfectly motionless at the foot of my bed. My heart started to pound, a cold dread seeping into my veins. I tried to move, but something held me in place. I was paralyzed, trapped beneath my sheets, unable to look away from the thing that was just watching me. I wanted to scream, to shake myself awake from what had to be a nightmare, but my voice was gone, my limbs frozen, and all I could do was lie there, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure looming over me. It had no features, just a vague outline, like it was draped in a dark cloak that merged with the shadows of the room. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it tilt its head, as if it was studying me, observing me with an almost curious intent. Every instinct I had told me this wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and terrifying that had no place in my bedroom, or anywhere in the world for that matter. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself I was just seeing things. I'd had a long week at work, my mind was exhausted. Maybe I was just imagining things, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became, and I realized that this wasn't a trick of my mind. This was real. The figure began to move. It took a single step closer to me, and that was when I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, a primal fear so intense it left me dizzy. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I strained to lift my arms, to grab anything that could act as a weapon. But I was paralyzed, held by some unseen force that was stronger than any nightmare. The figure took another step, its body now almost close enough to touch. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like an invisible hand around my throat, squeezing the air from my lungs. I shut my eyes, desperate for it to vanish, for this nightmare to dissolve. But when I opened them again, it was still there, closer than before. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural whisper, more like a hiss than actual words. It slid into my ears like ice, freezing me from the inside out. "You don't remember, do you?" A shiver ran through me. Remember? Remember what? The question lingered in the air, taunting me, digging into my mind like sharp claws. There was a part of me that knew, that understood on some primal level that this wasn't the first time I'd seen this figure, but I couldn't remember. The figure leaned down, its face, or whatever it had for a face, just inches from mine, and I could feel its cold breath against my skin. "You let me in," it whispered, "years ago. You invited me." My pulse quickened, and a rush of fragmented memories flashed through my mind. Flashes of dreams, strange, terrifying images of a shadow following me, always just out of sight. But I had dismissed them as nightmares, the kind you forget the moment you wake up. But now, as the figure loomed closer, I realized they weren't just dreams. They were memories. You wanted something, it continued, its voice coiling around me. Something that brought me here. In that moment, a memory broke through the fog. I was a child, barely 10, and I'd found an old book in my grandmother's attic. It was dusty and ancient, with pages that felt like they would crumble under my fingers. I remembered being fascinated, reading the strange, cryptic words in that dimly lit attic, whispering them out loud, pretending it was some kind of spell. My grandmother had found me, snatched the book out of my hands, her face pale as she scolded me, warning me never to touch it again. I hadn't understood then, but now, staring into the dark, hollow gaze of the figure before me, I understood. You called me, it said, and there was something like satisfaction in its tone, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And now, I am here. I wanted to scream, to apologize, to take it all back, but it was too late. I had invited this thing into my life, into my home, and it wasn't going to leave. The figure reached out, a long, bony hand stretching toward me, its fingers like claws hovering just above my chest. I could feel a pressure building, something dark and heavy pressing down on me as those fingers drew closer, as if it was reaching inside me, into my soul. I will return, it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath, but heavy with an ancient, terrifying promise. Again and again and again. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving me alone in the dark, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. My body trembled as I sat up, scanning the room, half expecting to see it lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to close my eyes again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, staring into the darkness, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified to let myself drift off. The memory of that night, of that figure, clung to me like a shadow, haunting my every step. Days turned into weeks, but the fear never left. Sometimes, late at night, I'd feel a chill at the foot of my bed, a faint whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me of the promise it had made. It will return. I know that now. It's only a matter of time. I didn't start hearing the footsteps until after the funeral. The house had always been quiet, filled only with the distant hum of cars outside and the occasional creak of old wood. After Mom passed, it seemed even the walls grieved. I couldn't bring myself to leave, so I took over her place, kept the rooms as they were, dusty memories preserved in each picture frame and worn-out rug. I wanted to feel close to her, I suppose, but soon I realized I wasn't alone. The first night I noticed, I was half asleep. I heard the soft patter, faint but unmistakable, pacing down the hallway just outside my room. I opened my eyes thinking maybe it was a neighbor's pet or the house settling, but the sound had rhythm. Step, 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 slow and deliberate, drawing closer. I held my breath, frozen, as it stopped right outside my door. Silence swallowed the air, dense and thick, pressing down on me until my heart thundered in my chest. Then, as if dismissed, the footsteps receded, fading away. I convinced myself it was nothing, some fluke of the mind, and fell back asleep. The next morning, the hallway was as empty as I'd left it, but I felt a lingering chill, something that had crept in during the night and taken root, lurking just beneath the surface of every shadow. By the third night, the footsteps came again. This time I was wide awake, lying there in the dark, waiting. They started quietly, like a whisper on the edge of sound, then grew louder, each step deliberate, the slow tap of bare feet against hardwood echoing through the silent house. They stopped again, just outside my bedroom door, as if whatever it was could sense I was listening. I got out of bed, heart racing, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the streetlight filtering through the front window. But the air was charged, thick with something invisible but potent, an unsettling feeling that burrowed under my skin. I stood there for a long time, staring into the empty hall, expecting someone or something to show itself. Nothing happened. After that, the footsteps became a nightly ritual. Every night, just past midnight, they would begin their slow, steady march from the far end of the hall, pausing outside my door before retreating back into the darkness. I started keeping a flashlight by my bed, along with my phone, ready to call someone, anyone, if I ever saw anything. But every time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. I told my friend James about it one evening. We were sitting in the living room, the silence pressing around us as he listened. "You're sure it's not a pipe or something?" he asked, his eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. "Pipes don't walk," I replied, the chill settling deeper in my bones. He offered to stay over, just to see if he'd hear anything himself, and I agreed. I think a part of me hoped he would hear them too, that I wasn't losing my mind. We stayed up late, drinking coffee and trying to ignore the suffocating quiet. Around midnight, I felt it again, that creeping chill, the sensation of something watching from the shadows. I glanced at James, and his eyes had widened, his face going pale. The footsteps began, faint at first, then louder. They were unmistakable, the steady pace, closer, closer. I looked at James, his mouth open in horror. He heard them too. And they stopped outside the door, as they always did. James grabbed my arm, his hand shaking as the silence fell over us. "Is this some kind of joke?" he whispered, barely audible. I shook my head, feeling the weight of the presence on the other side of the door. We both sat there, paralyzed. Then suddenly, the footsteps continued. But this time, instead of retreating, they moved into the living room. James let out a strangled gasp as we heard the soft, slow padding circling the room, like something invisible was pacing around us, examining us. And then, just as suddenly, they stopped. We spent the rest of the night awake, our nerves frayed. By morning, James was out the door, muttering apologies, and he didn't come back. After that night, things started escalating. I would find strange marks in the dust on the floor, small, bare footprints that trailed from one end of the hallway to the other. Sometimes they led to my door, stopping just inches from where I'd stood the night before. I tried cleaning them up, but they always returned, as if mocking me. One night, I tried to confront whatever it was. I sat up in bed, waiting for the familiar rhythm of footsteps. As they neared, my heart pounded, but I forced myself to call out, "Who's there?" The footsteps paused. The silence stretched, growing heavier by the second. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, I heard a reply. "Don't you remember me?" I froze, the words echoing in my head. The voice sounded faintly familiar, like a memory just out of reach. I wanted to run, but something held me there, rooted in place. "I don't know you," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause, and then, with chilling clarity, it responded, "You should." And then it was gone, the footsteps fading back down the hall. The days that followed were a blur of unease. I kept hearing it, the voice calling to me in the dead of night, urging me to remember. I started seeing shadows where there shouldn't be any, flickering at the edge of my vision. Every time I looked, there was nothing there. I hardly slept, my mind fraying under the constant fear. Finally, in desperation, I went up to the attic. It was a place I'd always avoided, filled with dusty boxes of memories, a lifetime of my mother's things. I felt something calling me there, a pull I couldn't resist. In a far corner, buried under layers of dust and forgotten trinkets, I found an old photograph. It was a picture of a young girl, her eyes bright with mischief, standing next to a boy. The boy was me, and the girl. She looked hauntingly familiar. Suddenly, memories flooded back, pieces of my childhood I'd buried. Her name was Lucy, my cousin. She'd stayed with us one summer, and we'd been inseparable. But one day, she disappeared, They said she'd wandered off and gotten lost, that she'd fallen into the river nearby. They never found her. But I remembered now. We'd been playing hide and seek, and I'd left her, hiding in the attic, telling her I'd be back. But I never returned. I'd forgotten her, forgotten the guilt, the sadness, buried deep in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed, I didn't need to wait long. The footsteps began, slow and measured, moving down the hall toward me. This time I didn't feel fear. I felt something else. A bone-deep sorrow, a realization of the truth I'd tried to bury. The footsteps stopped outside my door and I opened it. There, in the dim light, I saw her, a faint silhouette, her eyes filled with the same mischief I remembered. But there was something else, a shadow of betrayal. "Lucy," I whispered, my voice cracking. She didn't say anything, but her eyes held mine, an understanding passing between us. "I'm sorry," I choked out, tears streaming down my face. I didn't mean to leave you." For a moment, she just looked at me, her face a mixture of sorrow and relief. And then, slowly, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the darkness. The house was silent after that. The footsteps never returned, and the hallways felt empty, free from the shadows that had haunted them. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, half expecting to hear her, waiting outside my door. And in those moments, I wonder if she's truly gone, or if she's simply waiting somewhere, in the quiet places we can't see, for me to remember her again. I've spent my life as a night janitor for schools across 3 counties. I've seen and heard things that don't sit well when the lights are off and the halls go quiet. But there's one place I'll never forget. One school that still haunts me every time I close my eyes. I've only told this story once before. Now, as I sit here, I can still feel the prickling cold of that night. It was supposed to be just another job, but nothing has ever been the same since. I remember the day the call came. I just wrapped up a shift at Jefferson High when my supervisor phoned with an urgent need over at Crow's Hollow Middle School. The usual janitor had quit without notice. I was their go-to for short-notice jobs, so I didn't think much of it, just grabbed my keys and drove. Crow's Hollow was one of those old brick buildings from the 40s, crumbling at the edges with its unsettling charm. There'd always been rumors around town about it being haunted, but then again, every small town has that one place. I laughed it off with the kind of confidence only fools and night janitors have. I arrived around 9 p.m. and met the principal, Mrs. Alcott, in the empty main hall. She had a look about her like she hadn't slept in days. Her voice shook as she thanked me, and I remember noticing how she wouldn't look me in the eye. "Keep an eye on the 3rd floor east wing," she said, almost under her breath. "Strange things happen up there, you'll see." I brushed it off, assuming she was just trying to scare the new guy. But something in her voice lingered with me. She left quickly, her heels echoing in the silence until it was just me, alone, with nothing but the distant hum of the ancient radiator. The first few hours passed as they always did. I mopped, swept, emptied bins, and got lost in my routine. There was something soothing about the repetition, the swish of the mop, the creak of old pipes. Until, around midnight, I heard it. It started faint, a soft shuffling sound like someone dragging their feet across linoleum. It was coming from the 3rd floor east wing, exactly where Mrs. Alcott warned me. I stood at the bottom of the stairwell, flashlight in hand, listening, my heart pounding against my ribs. The sound grew louder as I climbed, each step amplifying it. When I reached the 3rd floor, the hallway was pitch dark. I flicked on my flashlight and felt the hairs on the back of my neck prick up. The light cut through the blackness, illuminating rows of lockers and faded posters of school events from a decade ago. At the end of the hall, I saw it. A shadow. Small and hunched over, it stood just barely visible, facing one of the lockers. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. No response. It didn't move. I took a hesitant step forward, and that's when I heard the whispering. A faint, chilling murmur drifted through the air, words I couldn't quite catch but that felt wrong, like a language I wasn't meant to understand. It was coming from the shadow, which remained completely still. I took another step forward, my heart hammering. The shadow turned slowly, revealing a pale face, too pale, like it had been drained of all life. Its eyes were hollow and its mouth stretched in a twisted smile that seemed to defy the anatomy of a human face. My breath hitched. It just stared, unblinking, unfeeling, frozen in that grotesque grin. I stumbled back, and as I did, the lights above me began to flicker, casting the hallway in a strobe of light and shadow. Each flash seemed to make the figure distort, its features twisting further, its limbs elongating unnaturally. Then, in one brief second of light, it was gone. I stumbled down the stairs, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. I could still hear the whispers, like they were trailing me, pulling at my ears. I fumbled with my keys, almost dropping them in my rush to get to the first floor. But as I passed by one of the classrooms, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to room 304 was wide open. I hadn't cleaned that room yet. Against every instinct, I stepped toward it, compelled by something I couldn't explain. The room was empty, except for a single desk pushed against the back wall. On it lay an old yearbook, dusty and forgotten. I opened it and flipped through the pages, revealing faded photos of students from years past. Near the end, I froze. There, on a page titled "In Loving Memory," was the photo of the very face I had just seen. A girl named Lila Ward, who had died in 1963. The caption said she had been found dead at the school, cause unknown. Rumor had it she'd been found clutching a small doll, her face twisted into an eerie smile. That was the final straw. I slammed the yearbook shut and bolted out of the room, determined to grab my stuff and leave. But as I turned, I saw her. Lila was standing in the doorway, holding a small, worn-out doll in her hand, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were empty pits, dark and unfeeling. Yet they followed me as I backed up against the wall, too paralyzed to move. Her mouth opened, and from it came a faint, echoing voice. "Play with me." The words were barely more than a whisper, but they echoed in my mind, scratching at my sanity. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like a weight pressing down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. Without another thought, I bolted past her, through the darkened hallways, down the stairs, not daring to look back. I could feel something following me, a presence that weighed down the air and quickened my steps. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one faster than the last as I dashed toward the exit. As I reached the main doors, they slammed shut in front of me with a deafening bang. I pulled, twisted, tried to force them open, but they wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I could still hear that voice, faint but relentless, growing louder with each passing second. "Play with me." My heart thundered as I whipped around, searching for another way out. That's when I saw her again, at the far end of the hallway, her doll dangling from her hand, her twisted smile glowing in the dim light. She began to move toward me, slowly at first, her bare feet padding silently against the floor. Her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, seemed to pierce right through me. In a final, desperate act, I ran to the nearest classroom, locking the door behind me. I pressed my back against it, breathing heavily, every fiber of my being on edge. The whispers filled the room, circling around me, growing louder, merging into a deafening cacophony. Then, silence. I opened my eyes, heart racing, and found myself alone in the room, the whispers gone. Trembling, I crept toward the door and peeked out into the hallway. Empty. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted for the exit, and this time the doors swung open. I stumbled out into the night, gasping for breath, only stopping once I reached my car. The next morning, Mrs. Alcott called me. Her voice was low, barely a whisper. Did you see her?" she asked, her voice filled with a sadness I couldn't quite place. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. That was the last time I worked at Crow's Hollow Middle School. To this day, I still hear her whisper sometimes, just as I'm about to fall asleep. "Play with me." The day I decided to explore that abandoned hospital was the day I should have listened to my gut. But curiosity, as they say, often drowns out common sense. I'm not someone who scares easily. I've always had this weird thrill for haunted places. The thrill of stepping into a space where reality blurs with the unknown. But what I found in there? No thrill can justify the terror I felt. It was St. Mary's Memorial, an old hospital in a small town upstate. Closed decades ago, it was the sort of place people rarely mentioned, and if they did, it was in hushed tones. They said it was haunted, murmured about strange noises, shadowy figures in the windows, and a lingering chill that never left your skin. I brushed it off as urban legend nonsense, the kind people build up around any empty, decaying building. So one night, with only my flashlight and camera, I headed there alone. The moment I stepped inside, a strange smell hit me, like stale air mixed with something metallic and rotten. I pointed my flashlight around the dusty reception area, its walls covered in peeling paint, revealing splotches of an old green color that gave the room an eerie, sickly glow. Furniture lay overturned, chairs strewn about as if left in a hurry. But it was the silence that struck me the hardest. It wasn't the typical quiet you'd expect in an empty building. It was an oppressive, suffocating quiet, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I made my way deeper into the building, weaving through dark corridors and flickering my flashlight over remnants of hospital life long abandoned. Rusted gurneys, cracked vials, and broken syringes scattered across the floor. Each step echoed, and with every sound, I found myself glancing over my shoulder. I was being watched. The sensation grew stronger the further I walked, the walls seeming to close in around me. Then I reached the surgery wing. I turned a corner, and my flashlight caught something in its beam. A message scrawled on the wall in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. It read, "Help me. They won't let me leave." I felt a shiver creep down my spine, a visceral reaction that made my skin prickle. The words were smudged and faded, as if they'd been there for decades, but the implication was clear. Someone had been here once, trapped and desperate. For the first time, I felt a pang of fear. A rational part of me screamed to turn back, to get out while I still could. But something stronger, a morbid curiosity, pushed me forward. I came across a stairwell leading down to the basement. As I descended, the air grew colder, and the smell intensified. At the bottom, I found myself in what must have been the morgue. My flashlight barely illuminated the space, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with each movement. Along one wall stood a series of rusted metal drawers, the kind used to store bodies, each one marked with a worn metal tag. I held my breath as I moved closer, drawn to one in particular. Its tag read, "Patient 43." The moment I touched the handle, I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing. The shadows, however, felt heavier, darker somehow, as if something was just out of sight, watching. I turned back to the drawer and, almost involuntarily, tugged it open. Inside was nothing but an old, tattered hospital gown. A chill ran through me as I realized it was stained, not with dust or mold, but with dark, dried patches that looked suspiciously like blood. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the kind you get when someone is standing too close, breathing down your skin. I whipped around, but once again, there was nothing. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, I heard it, a faint whisper echoing in the darkness. "Help me." I froze, every hair on my body standing up. The voice was weak, like someone barely clinging to life. It was coming from the far corner of the room. I lifted my flashlight, illuminating an empty gurney covered in a yellowed sheet. The whisper grew louder as I approached, my heart thundering in my chest. "Please, help me." The voice was unmistakable, a desperate plea soaked with pain. I reached the gurney and, with trembling hands, pulled back the sheet. There was no one there, just an empty slab, cold and bare. But the moment I touched it, a surge of images flooded my mind. Visions of a woman strapped down, her face contorted in agony, her mouth opening in a silent scream as shadowy figures loomed over her. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My flashlight flickered, casting the room in and out of darkness. And then, just as quickly, everything went silent. I backed up toward the door, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. But the light began to dim, and in the darkness, I could see them. Shadowy figures, barely visible, moving closer. Panicking, I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. It felt like an invisible force was pressing against it, trapping me inside. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, each pulse a reminder that I was locked in with them. I heard footsteps, soft, shuffling, like something dragging itself across the floor. It was getting closer, closer. I threw my shoulder against the door in desperation. It finally gave way, and I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't look back, too terrified to see if anything was following me. I ran through the twisting corridors, the shadows chasing me, whispers echoing from every corner. "Help us! Don't leave us!" I reached the exit door and slammed through it, collapsing onto the gravel outside. I scrambled to my feet, running until I reached my car, only stopping when I was safely inside, the doors locked. But even as I drove away, I could still feel it. That oppressive chill, the faint whisper of voices begging for help. I looked back at the hospital, and in one of the upper windows, I thought I saw a face staring down at me. A pale, hollow-eyed face frozen in an expression of pure terror. I never went back to St. Mary's Memorial, but some nights, when I'm lying in bed, I hear them. The whispers, the faint, pleading cries of souls still trapped in that decaying tomb. And I wonder, just for a moment, if they're still waiting for someone foolish enough to answer their cries. It was just supposed to be a casual stroll through the weekend flea market, a place my girlfriend Cassie and I went to kill time, hunting for the occasional oddity or dusty trinket to add to our growing collection of strange finds. But that afternoon, something was different. I could feel it. A tingling, prickling sensation on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching us as we walked from stall to stall. I tried to ignore it, but then Cassie stopped short at a booth overflowing with old records, vintage postcards, and strange items from all over the world. In the middle of it all was a small, unassuming music box. It was polished, dark wood with delicate engravings of swirling vines, and something that looked like a bird or creature with wide eyes and wings stretched wide. It looked old, far older than anything else in the booth. "Look at this," Cassie said, her voice soft, almost entranced. She reached out to touch it, and the vendor, a hunched elderly man with silver hair and wrinkled hands, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. "Ah, you have a keen eye," he rasped. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it was heavy with something I couldn't place. A warning, maybe, or a dark promise. "That's no ordinary music box?" Cassie looked up at him, curious. "What's so special about it?" The man leaned closer, and I caught a faint, musty scent on his clothes. "They say an evil spirit was trapped in there long ago, a vengeful spirit. If you open the box and listen to the song, the spirit latches onto you." Cassie smirked. "Well, that's creepy." The man's face remained grave. "Once you open the box, it cannot be closed again. The spirit stays with you, slowly taking over your life." Cassie and I exchanged glances. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, but Cassie's fascination was piqued. She loved stories like this. I chalked it up to a scare tactic, some gimmick to make a sale. I mean, who would seriously believe a spirit could be trapped in a box? Cassie didn't. She bought it for a few dollars, and the man placed it in a small paper bag, muttering a strange word under his breath as he handed it over. "You have been warned," he whispered, eyes fixed on Cassie as we walked away. That night, after a few drinks, Cassie insisted we try it out. We were sitting in her dimly lit living room, the box resting between us on the coffee table. She reached out, running her fingers over the intricate carvings again. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, laughing nervously. "Oh, come on, don't be a chicken," she teased, giving me a playful nudge. She turned the tiny key at the bottom of the box, and with a soft click, it began to play a haunting melody, soft, slow, and deeply unsettling. There was something about the notes that felt off. They echoed through the room, almost vibrating in the air like a whisper you could barely hear. I felt my chest tighten as if the room itself was pressing in on us. Cassie seemed to feel it too. Her smile faded, and a strange look came over her face. She looked pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the box. "Do you hear?" she started, her voice trailing off. I did hear it. Beneath the music there was something else. A faint, eerie wail like someone crying out from far away. It sent a chill down my spine, and I reached out to close the box, but it wouldn't budge. The lid was jammed open, as if an invisible hand was holding it in place. "Cassie, let's stop this," I whispered, my voice trembling, but she just stared at it, unblinking. "Isn't it beautiful?" she murmured, her voice hollow. I shook her shoulder, breaking her trance. She blinked, startled, and shook her head as if waking from a dream. What happened?" "You were out of it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This thing, there's something wrong with it." She didn't argue. We stuffed the music box back into the bag and tried to ignore it, but that night, neither of us could sleep. I kept hearing the melody echo in my head, over and over, like it was seeping into my bones. The next day, things got worse. Cassie called me in a panic. "Jake, something's wrong. I'm seeing things." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I looked in the mirror this morning and I saw someone else staring back at me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She looked just like me, but her eyes were empty. My stomach twisted, and I drove over to her place as fast as I could. When I arrived, she was pale and shaking, clutching the music box like it was some kind of lifeline. "I tried throwing it away, Jake, but every time I do, it comes back," she said, her voice breaking. "What do you mean it comes back?" I asked, barely believing my own ears. "I threw it in the dumpster and then I walked inside, and it was back on the table, right where it was last night." We tried everything, throwing it away, burying it, even smashing it with a hammer, but it remained perfectly intact. It was like it had some dark hold on her, and each time she looked at it, her face grew paler, her eyes more hollow. Over the next few days, Cassie's condition worsened. She barely slept, and when she did, she'd wake up screaming, her face twisted in terror. She'd describe the same recurring dream, a woman trapped inside the music box, clawing at the walls and screaming, her face contorted in rage and pain. One night, I woke up to the sound of the music box playing in my apartment. It was 3 a.m, and the eerie melody filled my bedroom, growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. My hands trembled as I followed the sound to the living room, where I found Cassie standing in the dark, the music box cradled in her hands, her face blank and expressionless. "Cassie?" I whispered, fear gripping my chest. Her head snapped up and she stared at me with eyes that weren't hers anymore. They were cold, hollow, and dark, filled with something ancient and cruel. "She's trapped in here." Cassie whispered, her voice distorted and harsh. "And now, so am I." I tried to grab the box from her hands, but she held on tight, her grip unnaturally strong. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt my vision blur, my head spinning. I stumbled back, covering my ears, but the sound drilled into my skull, filling my mind with images of twisted, shadowed faces and whispers in a language I couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the music stopped. I opened my eyes to find Cassie slumped on the floor, the box lying beside her, its lid finally closed. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "Jake, I don't think it'll ever let me go." In the days that followed, Cassie seemed different. She was quieter, her laughter gone, her eyes dull and haunted. She'd go through the motions, but there was an emptiness about her, like something had been taken from her that could never be replaced. As for the music box, it vanished one day. I don't know where it went, and I'm not sure I want to know. Sometimes I'll still hear the faint echo of that haunting melody in my dreams, and I'll wake up drenched in sweat, half expecting to see Cassie standing in the dark, holding that cursed box. Cassie and I don't talk about it anymore. She moved away, trying to start fresh, but I know deep down that she'll never be free of it. Neither will I. There are nights when I'll see her in my dreams, standing there with hollow eyes, clutching that music box, her face twisted in pain as the melody plays on, over and over. And each time, the melody sounds louder, more insistent, as if it's waiting for me to listen. Just one more time. I'd always thought the house I bought was a dream. A quiet, two-story farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, with wide fields and a forest that bordered the back edge of the property. It was the perfect escape from the hectic pulse of the city, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But then, it started. It began as a faint scratching sound in the walls. Small, almost unnoticeable. I chalked it up to rodents, mice, maybe, or squirrels. It's an old house, I reasoned. Old houses have creaks and groans, the kind you learn to tune out. But as the weeks went on, the scratching got louder. And worse, it seemed to follow me. One night, I lay in bed, straining to listen as the noise grew stronger, almost frantic. There was no way it was a mouse. Whatever was inside the wall was big, and it knew exactly where I was. My mind raced through explanations, but none of them made sense. I didn't want to tell anyone. It was the kind of thing that would get you laughed at. So I decided to deal with it myself. I'd take down a piece of the wall, see what was in there, and put an end to the mystery once and for all. The following morning, I set to work with a hammer and chisel, starting on the section where I'd heard the scratching most often, right above my bed. The plaster crumbled easily, revealing a dark, hollow space behind the wall. I leaned in, squinting into the void, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. But there was nothing. No nest, no rodents, just empty darkness. I let out a shaky laugh, feeling ridiculous for letting a few noises get to me like that. I patched the hole and tried to put it out of my mind. For a few days, things were quiet. I began to think that maybe it had been my imagination after all, that maybe stress or loneliness had just played tricks on my mind. But then, one night, I heard it again. Except this time, it wasn't scratching. It was breathing. It was soft, steady, almost rhythmic, like someone taking slow, deep breaths right behind my head. I lay frozen in bed, every hair on my body standing on end as I listened to the sound. My rational mind fought for control, trying to convince myself that it was just wind, or maybe the old pipes expanding. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The breathing grew louder, more pronounced. I could almost feel the weight of it pressing against me, as if someone was leaning in, whispering breaths right into my ear. And then, I heard it. 2 words, barely a whisper but unmistakable. "Hello there." I bolted upright, my heart slamming against my chest as I looked around the dark room. But there was no one there, just the quiet of the night and the stillness of the room. I spent the rest of that night wide awake, the memory of that voice echoing in my mind. The next day, I called a friend to come over, someone who wouldn't laugh at me for being paranoid. She listened carefully as I described everything, her face growing pale as I recounted the breathing, the voice, the way it seemed to be following me. "You need to get out of here," she said finally, her voice a hushed whisper. "That doesn't sound like an animal or even a person. It sounds like something else." I wanted to listen to her. I really did. But leaving wasn't that simple. I'd put everything into this place. It was my dream home. I couldn't just abandon it. So, I did the next best thing. I set up cameras in every room, trained on the walls, and any place where I thought I might catch a glimpse of whatever it was. For a few nights, nothing happened. The cameras picked up only silence and darkness. But then, on the 5th night, something changed. I was reviewing the footage from my bedroom camera when I saw it. A shadow, flickering in and out, right by the wall. At first, it was subtle, just a slight movement that I could have mistaken for a trick of the light. But then it moved closer, and I saw the outline of a face, pressed right up against the wall, its eyes staring directly at the camera. The face was pale, with wide, unblinking eyes, and a mouth that seemed twisted into a grotesque smile. It lingered there for a moment, staring unblinking, as if it could see me watching it through the footage. And then it mouthed a single word: "Stay." I stumbled back from the screen, my pulse racing as fear washed over me. The entity had seen me. It knew I was watching it, and it was inviting me to stay. Or was it daring me to? That night I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. I sat up on the couch downstairs, but even there, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shift of the house made me jump. I knew I was losing it, but I was trapped, helpless against the strange terror that had taken over my home. I tried calling a priest, but he wouldn't come. He told me over the phone that sometimes things are bound to certain places, and disturbing them only makes them stronger. I had nowhere else to go, no one who would understand what I was going through. I was alone with whatever this thing was, and it wasn't going anywhere. Days turned into weeks, and the presence in the walls only grew stronger. The breathing came every night, sometimes close enough that I could feel the faint stir of air against my skin. And the voice, it spoke more often now, always in that low, rasping whisper. "Stay. Don't leave. I'm waiting." It had started scratching again, too, harder and more erratic, as if it was trying to claw its way out. I'd lie in bed, listening to it scrape against the walls, the sound echoing through my head long after it stopped. Finally, one night, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up a hammer and went straight to the wall where the scratching was loudest. I started to pound, ripping through the plaster, tearing at it with a desperation I didn't know I was capable of. I broke through the wall and saw a dark, narrow space behind it. And then slowly, something shifted in the darkness. A hand, skeletal and impossibly thin, reached out, pressing against the edge of the hole. I stumbled back, horrified, as the rest of it followed. A figure, twisted and emaciated, crawling out of the darkness. Its face was that same pale, grotesque smile, and its eyes, cold, empty pits, locked onto mine. "Stay," it hissed, inching closer. "Stay with me. I've been waiting so long." My body was frozen in place as it crept toward me, its hands reaching out, those long, spindly fingers stretching toward my face. In a last desperate surge of energy, I turned and ran, bolting down the stairs, out of the house and into the night. I never went back. The house stands empty now, its walls sealed and silent. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is still, I swear I can hear it. A faint, scratching sound, as if something, or someone, is still trying to claw its way out, still whispering those same dreadful words. Stay. They say certain objects carry the essence of their owners, and I used to laugh at that. I always thought family heirlooms were just dusty keepsakes, relics of lives long gone. But I was wrong. Horribly, dreadfully wrong. I remember the first time I laid eyes on the old hand mirror. I was sifting through my grandmother's belongings after she'd passed. The mirror was tucked away in a cedar chest, wrapped in an old shawl. I don't know why it stood out to me among her many treasures, but something about it felt alive. My fingertips tingled when I brushed the ornate frame, a sensation like static in the air. I convinced myself it was just sentimentality, the heaviness of the day. But that night, I began to understand that some family heirlooms carry more than memories. The mirror was old, its silver frame tarnished and the glass cracked at the edge. Strange etchings ran along the border, figures that looked like people at first, but when I squinted, seemed to twist into something more sinister. Still, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. For some reason, I felt compelled to keep it, like a silent promise to my grandmother. That first night, I had trouble sleeping. My dreams felt dark, filled with shadows that shifted and crawled just out of reach. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But every time I looked around, nothing seemed out of place. Nothing except that mirror on my dresser, which I could have sworn was angled just a bit differently than how I'd left it. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks, at least until the second night. I woke up at 3:15 a.m. to the sound of muffled whispers. They were soft, barely audible, but they grew louder with each passing second. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a source, but there was nothing, just the mirror, sitting still on the dresser, the whispers seeming to bleed from its frame. It took everything in me to get up and approach it. As I got closer, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A shadow moved inside the glass, faint and distorted. It shifted as if pacing, but there was no one there. I leaned in, almost hypnotized, and that's when the shadow stopped. It was as though it sensed me watching, and then, slowly, its shape sharpened into something vaguely human. Its face featureless, but its eyes, two dark pits, stared back at me, full of malice. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind raced, and I tried to rationalize it. I'd heard of people imagining things in reflective surfaces, their minds conjuring up shapes and figures. But this felt too real, too specific. The next day I was tempted to toss the mirror, to take it somewhere far away and leave it behind. But something stronger than fear kept me from doing it. It was as if I was tethered to that cursed object, held by some invisible chain. That night, I tried covering the mirror with a sheet, thinking that might put a stop to the unsettling visions and whispers. It only made things worse. I'd barely drifted to sleep when I was jolted awake by a loud crash. The sheet had been thrown off the mirror, and the room was filled with the scent of something old and decayed. The whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the air like a chant. I could make out fragments of words, though none made sense. It was an ancient language, guttural and harsh, grating against my ears. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, I was drawn to the mirror once more. This time, the shadow inside had a more defined shape. It was no longer a vague blur, but a woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned gown. Her head was bowed, and her hands were clasped in front of her as if in mourning. I whispered, "Who are you?" though I half expected no answer. But slowly, her head lifted, and she looked at me through hollow, empty eyes. Her mouth moved, forming silent words, and yet somehow I could hear her voice inside my head. "You took what was mine." The voice was both hollow and full, resonating with sorrow and anger. I stammered, feeling a chill shoot down my spine. I realized with a sickening dread that the mirror wasn't just haunted, it was cursed, bound to its original owner in some horrific way. The days blurred after that. I tried everything to rid myself of the mirror. I threw it out with the trash, only to find it sitting back on my dresser the next morning. I even buried it in the yard one night, but by dawn it was back, its glass somehow more cracked than before, the etched figures on the frame twisting into tormented faces. That's when I decided to dig deeper into my family's history, hoping to find some explanation. It turned out that the mirror had once belonged to my great-grandmother, a woman named Eloise, who was rumored to be a medium. Stories in the family said she'd communicated with spirits using that mirror, drawing out the souls of the lost, sometimes to guide them, sometimes to control them. But something had gone wrong. One spirit she'd summoned had been too powerful, too malevolent, and had attached itself to the mirror. Eloise was said to have tried to destroy it, but every attempt only made the curse stronger. Eventually, the mirror passed down through the family, each owner experiencing strange misfortunes, accidents, illness, even madness. As I read about my ancestors, it felt as if the mirror was watching me, its presence growing heavier, more oppressive. It began appearing in places it shouldn't, sometimes at the foot of my bed, other times right outside my bathroom door. And every night the whispers grew louder, the face of the woman in the mirror growing more distinct, her eyes filling with a hatred that seemed to reach through the glass. One night, in desperation, I took a hammer to the mirror, smashing it to pieces. The glass shattered, but each fragment still held a part of her image. The woman's face stared back at me from every shard, her mouth twisted in a scream, a sound that filled my ears even though her mouth made no noise. I gathered up the shards, every last piece, and buried them in the woods, praying that would be the end of it. For a while, things were calm. The house felt lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. I allowed myself to believe that I'd finally freed myself from the curse. Until one evening, I noticed something glinting from beneath my bed. I reached down, my fingers closing around a small, sharp object. It was a shard of the mirror, a tiny sliver with the same twisted face staring back at me, her hollow eyes filled with unending rage. I knew then that the curse wasn't just tied to the mirror, it was part of me now, bound through my bloodline, passed down like an inheritance of despair. And every night, as I lie in bed, I hear her whispers growing louder, her face appearing in every reflective surface, always watching, always waiting. I've tried warning my family, but they think I'm losing my mind, and maybe I am. But one thing is certain, if you ever come across a family heirloom, think twice before claiming it. Some things, some curses, should be left buried and forgotten. As for me, there's no escaping her now. It's been almost a year since that night, and I still feel a chill whenever I think about it. I try not to. There's something about those memories that feels wrong, as if remembering will somehow bring everything back. But when I close my eyes, the images are still vivid, the sounds just as haunting. It started like most foolish adventures with a dare. Just me, Alex, Sam, and Jordan, sitting in my parents' old cabin near Creekside, a quiet town where nothing much happened. We'd grown up around here, heard the rumors about the forest just beyond the town limits, a place that kids talked about in hushed tones and adults tried to forget even existed. The Creekside forest was a sprawling, dense stretch of trees, moss, and undergrowth that seemed to swallow up all sound and light. Over the years, it had earned a dark reputation. People went missing. Some said they'd just gotten lost and perished in the wilderness. But others, more than I care to remember, believed that something lived there. Something unnatural. The old-timers at the local diner called it the Restless Woods. They swore that something lurked within, some presence that could make people vanish without a trace. I'd always thought it was just a legend, but on that night, it somehow didn't feel so far-fetched. Jordan brought up the idea. "Let's go in," he said, grinning like he always did when he was about to suggest something stupid. "Come on, what are we, 12? You guys can't really still believe those stories." Sam shook her head, laughing nervously. "I don't know, Jordan. People do get lost in there. Plus, you remember Noah, right? He swore he heard things in there before he got out. Said he could feel something watching him. That's exactly why we have to go, Alex chimed in. Just to prove it's all nonsense. We'll go in, walk around a bit, and come out. Easy. I was skeptical. But there's something about being with friends that makes you feel invincible, like you can brush off fears that might have stopped you alone. So, against my better judgment, I found myself agreeing. We packed a few things: flashlights, water, a couple of sandwiches. The sky was a dull gray, fading into the deep blue of dusk as we stepped off the main road and onto the narrow dirt path that led into Creekside Forest. It was quiet, more silent than it should have been. Our footsteps crunched on dry leaves, and we all joked at first, trying to lighten the mood. But as the trees closed in, it became harder to laugh. The deeper we went, the stranger the air felt. It wasn't just cold, it was heavy, almost stifling. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker, like they were trying to trap us in. Jordan was the first to notice something odd. "Hey, look at this," he said, pointing to a tree. Deep scratches, like claw marks, ran down its trunk, freshly gouged into the bark. They were too deep for any animal around here. Sam took a step back, her face paling. "Those don't look like scratches from a bear or anything. They're different. Maybe someone's just trying to scare people off," Alex said, but he didn't sound convinced. We moved on, trying to ignore the unsettling marks, but they kept appearing. Every few yards, we'd find another tree with those same deep grooves, like something had been marking its territory. And then there was the silence. It was absolute. Not a single bird chirped, no rustle of animals in the underbrush. It was as if the forest had been abandoned by everything natural. An hour passed. The deeper we went, the more disoriented we became. We should have hit the clearing by then, a spot we'd used as kids when we played hide-and-seek in the woods. But it felt like the forest was shifting, keeping us from finding it. Does anyone else feel like we're being watched? Sam's voice was barely a whisper, as if she was afraid to speak too loudly. I felt it too. An awareness, an uncomfortable sensation at the back of my mind, as if someone, or something, was lurking just out of sight, studying us. We started seeing movement out of the corners of our eyes. Shadows flickering between the trees, dark forms just beyond the reach of our flashlights. Every time we turned to look, there was nothing there. But we all felt it, that dreadful certainty that we were not alone. Alex tried to laugh it off. "Probably just raccoons or something. Let's keep going." But his voice was strained. There was no disguising the fear now. The forest was growing darker, the tree branches above blocking out what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. And then we found it. A small abandoned campsite. Just a few scattered belongings. A backpack, a half-burnt jacket, a rusted canteen. But no sign of anyone. "Maybe they got lost and left this behind," Jordan suggested, but he didn't sound convinced. We all knew the stories of people who had entered these woods and never came back. Sam picked up the jacket, her face going pale. This is Noah's. I recognized the patch on the sleeve." We all froze. Noah had disappeared over 2 years ago. He'd gone camping in these woods and never returned. His family had searched for weeks, but no trace of him was ever found. And now here we were, standing in his abandoned campsite, his belongings scattered like he'd just walked away. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The forest felt like it was closing in on us, the trees pressing closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from somewhere in the distance, a branch snapping underfoot. We all turned, our flashlights swinging wildly, but there was nothing there, just shadows, stretching and twisting in unnatural shapes. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." We turned back the way we'd come, but somehow the path had changed. The trees looked different, unfamiliar. We walked faster, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. But the forest only grew denser, the darkness pressing in around us. Our flashlights flickered, the batteries suddenly dying in unison, plunging us into pitch black. Panic set in. Sam grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "This isn't right. We're walking in circles. I can feel it." "Just keep moving," Jordan urged, but his voice was shaking. "We'll find the road." As we stumbled through the darkness, strange sounds began to fill the air. Whispers, faint and barely audible, like voices carried on the wind. They were too quiet to make out, but there was an urgency to them, a desperation. And beneath them, something else. A low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. We broke into a run, tripping over roots and rocks, our breaths ragged and shallow. The sounds followed us, growing louder, closer. And then we saw it, a figure standing between the trees. Just a shadow at first, but as we got closer, I saw its eyes. They were empty, hollow, staring at us with a malevolence that felt almost human. It didn't move. It just watched, as if waiting for us to come closer. And then, in an instant, it was gone, just vanished, like smoke dispersing into the air. But the feeling remained, that awful sensation of being hunted. We ran until we could barely breathe, our legs aching, our lungs burning, and just when I thought we'd never escape, we broke through the trees, stumbling onto the road. We were out, but the silence was still there, the weight of the forest lingering in the air. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the cabin. There were no jokes, no bravado, just a heavy, suffocating fear that hung over us, unspoken but understood. We knew we'd been lucky to make it out, and deep down I knew we'd left something behind, something that was still watching, waiting. In the weeks that followed, we each dealt with it in our own way. Sam moved away. Jordan and Alex refused to talk about it. But for me, the memories linger. The empty eyes, the whispers in the dark. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear them. Those faint, desperate voices calling out from the heart of the forest, warning me never to return.